Welcome to Slothful Slumber, the podcast where we transform the vast knowledge of the internet into a gentle lullaby for your mind. I'm your host, Luna Dreamwell, and I'm here to guide you on a journey to tranquility through the soothing cadence of Wikipedia articles. Each episode will delve into the most wonderfully mundane and sleep-inducing topics, helping you drift off into a realm of serene dreams. So find your comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the dull hum of information carry you into a restful slumber. Now, let's embark on tonight's voyage of tranquil learning as we explore a topic so peacefully uneventful it just might whisk you away to the land of dreams. This Wikipedia article is titled Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration, Meiji Ishin, referred to at the time as the Honorable Restoration, Goishin, and also known as the Meiji Renovation, Revolution, Regeneration, Reform, or Renewal, was a political event that restored practical imperial rule to Japan in 1868 under Emperor Meiji. Although there were ruling emperors before the Meiji Restoration, the events restored practical abilities and consolidated the political system under the Emperor of Japan. The goals of the restored government were expressed by the new emperor in the Charter Oath. The Restoration led to enormous changes in Japan's political and social structure and spanned both the late Edo period, often called the Bakumatsu, and the beginning of the Meiji era, during which time Japan rapidly industrialized and adopted Western ideas and production methods. Foreign influence. In 1853, Commodore Matthew C. Perry arrived in Japan. A year later, Perry returned in threatening large warships with the hope of concluding a treaty that would open up Japanese ports for trade. Perry concluded the treaty that would open up two Japanese ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, only for material support, such as firewood, water, food, and coal for U.S. ships. The Convention of Kanagawa was signed in 1854, and this opened up trade between the United States and Japan. Later, Japan reluctantly expanded its trade deals to France, Britain, Netherlands, and Russia due to American pressure. These treaties signed with Western powers came to be known as unequal treaties as Japan lost control over its tariffs, while Western powers took control over Japanese lands. In 1858, Townsend Harris, ambassador to Japan, concluded the treaty, opening Japanese ports to trade. Figures like Shimazu Nariakira concluded that if we take the initiative, we can dominate. If we do not, we will be dominated, leading Japan to throw open its doors to foreign technology. After the humiliation of the unequal treaties, the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, as this revolution came to be known, acted in the name of restoring imperial rule to strengthen Japan against the threat of being colonized, bringing to an end the era known as Sakoku. The word Meiji means enlightened rule, and the goal was to combine modern advances with traditional Eastern values. The main leaders of this were Ito Hirobumi, Matsukata Masayoshi, Kido Takayoshi, Itagaki Taisuke, Yamagata Aritomo, Mori Arinori, Okubo Toshimichi, and Yamaguchi Naoyoshi. Imperial Restoration. The foundation of the Meiji Restoration was the 1866 Satsuma Choshu alliance between Saigo Takamori and Kido Takayoshi, leaders of the reformist elements in the Satsuma and Choshu domains at the southwestern end of the Japanese archipelago. These two leaders supported the Emperor Komei, Emperor Meiji's father, and were brought together by Sakamoto Ryoma for the purpose of challenging the ruling Tokugawa shogunate, Bakufu, and restoring the emperor to power. After Komei's death on the 30th of January 1867, Meiji ascended the throne on February 3rd. This period also saw Japan change from being a feudal society to having a centralized nation and left the Japanese with a lingering influence of modernity. In the same year, the koban was discontinued as a form of currency. End of the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa government had been founded in the 17th century and initially focused on re-establishing order in social, political, and international affairs after a century of warfare. The political structure, established by Tokugawa Ieyasu and solidified under his two immediate successors, his son Tokugawa Hidetada, who ruled from 1616 to 1623, and grandson Tokugawa Iemitsu, 1623 to 51, bound all daimyos to the shogunate and limited any individual daimyo from acquiring too much land or power. The Tokugawa shogunate came to its official end on the 9th of November 1867, when Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the 15th Tokugawa shogun, put his prerogatives at the emperor's disposal and resigned 10 days later. This was effectively the restoration, Taisei Hokan, of imperial rule, although Yoshinobu still had significant influence, and it was not until January 3rd, the following year, with the young emperor's edict, that the restoration fully occurred. On the 3rd of January 1868, the emperor stripped Yoshinobu of all power and made a formal declaration of the restoration of his power. The Emperor of Japan announces to the sovereigns of all foreign countries and to their subjects that permission has been granted to the shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu to return the governing power in accordance with his own request. We shall henceforward exercise supreme authority in all the internal and external affairs of the country. Consequently, the title of emperor must be substituted for that of Taikun, in which the treaties have been made. Officers are being appointed by us to the conduct of foreign affairs. It is desirable that the representatives of the treaty powers recognize this announcement. Shortly thereafter, in January 1868, the Boshin War started with the Battle of Toba Fushimi, in which Choshu and Satsuma's forces defeated the ex-shogun's army. All Tokugawa lands were seized and placed under imperial control, thus placing them under the prerogative of the new Meiji government. With Fuhanken Sanchise, the areas were split into three types: urban prefectures, Fu, rural prefectures, Ken, and the already existing domains. On March 23rd, the Dutch minister-resident Dirk de Graaf van Polsbroek and the French minister-resident Léon Roche were the first European envoys ever to receive a personal audience with Meiji in Edo, Tokyo. This audience laid the foundation for modern Dutch diplomacy in Japan. Subsequently, de Graaf van Polsbroek assisted the emperor and the government in their negotiations with representatives of the major European powers. In 1869, the daimyos of the Tosa, Hizen, Satsuma, and Choshu domains, who were pushing most fiercely against the shogunate, were persuaded to return their domains to the emperor. Other daimyo were subsequently persuaded to do so, thus creating a central government in Japan, which exercised direct power through the entire realm. Some shogunate forces escaped to Hokkaido, where they attempted to set up a breakaway republic of Ezo. However, forces loyal to the emperor ended this attempt in May 1869 with the Battle of Hakodate in Hokkaido. The defeat of the armies of the former shogun, led by Enomoto Takeaki and Hijikata Toshizo, marked the final end of the Tokugawa shogunate, with the emperor's power fully restored. Finally, by 1872, the daimyos, past and present, were summoned before the emperor, where it was declared that all domains were now to be returned to the emperor. The roughly 280 domains were turned into 72 prefectures, each under the control of a state-appointed governor. If the daimyos peacefully complied, they were given a prominent voice in the new Meiji government. Later, their debts and payments of samurai stipends were either taxed heavily or turned into bonds, which resulted in a large loss of wealth among former samurai. Military reform. Emperor Meiji announced in his 1868 Charter Oath that knowledge shall be sought all over the world, and thereby the foundations of imperial rule shall be strengthened. Under the leadership of Mori Arenori, a group of prominent Japanese intellectuals went on to form the Meiji Six Society in 1873 to continue to promote civilization and enlightenment through modern ethics and ideas. However, during the Restoration, political power simply moved from the Tokugawa shogunate to an oligarchy consisting of these leaders, mostly from Satsuma Province, Okubo Toshimichi and Saigo Takamori, and Choshu Province, Ito Hirobumi, Yamagata Aritomo, and Kido Takayoshi. This reflected their belief in the more traditional practice of imperial rule, whereby the Emperor of Japan served solely as the spiritual authority of the nation, and his ministers governed the nation in his name. The Meiji oligarchy that formed the government under the rule of the emperor first introduced measures to consolidate their power against the remnants of the Edo period government, the shogunate, daimyos, and the samurai class. Throughout Japan at the time, the samurai numbered 1.9 million. For comparison, this was more than 10 times the size of the French privileged class before the 1789 French Revolution. Moreover, the samurai in Japan were not merely the lords, but also their higher retainers, people who actually worked. With each samurai being paid fixed stipends, their upkeep presented a tremendous financial burden, which may have prompted the oligarchs to action. Whatever their true intentions, the oligarchs embarked on another slow and deliberate process to abolish the samurai class. First, in 1873, it was announced that the samurai stipends were to be taxed on a rolling basis. Later, in 1874, the samurai were given the option to convert their stipends into government bonds. Finally, in 1876, this commutation was made compulsory. To reform the military, the government instituted nationwide conscription in 1873, mandating that every male would serve for 4 years in the armed forces upon turning 21 years old, followed by 3 more years in the reserves. One of the primary differences between the samurai and peasant classes was the right to bear arms. This ancient privilege was suddenly extended to every male in the nation. Furthermore, samurai were no longer allowed to walk about town bearing a sword or weapon to show their status. This led to a series of riots from disgruntled samurai. One of the major riots was the one led by Saigo Takamori, the Satsuma Rebellion, which eventually turned into a civil war. This rebellion was, however, put down swiftly by the newly formed Imperial Japanese Army, trained in Western tactics and weapons, even though the core of the new army was the Tokyo police force, which was largely composed of former samurai. This sent a strong message to the dissenting samurai that their time was indeed over. There were fewer subsequent samurai uprisings, and the distinction became all but a name as the samurai joined the new society. The ideal of samurai military spirit lived on in romanticized form and was often used as propaganda during the early 20th century wars of the Empire of Japan. However, it is equally true that the majority of samurai were content despite having their status abolished. Many found employment in the government bureaucracy, which resembled an elite class in its own right. The samurai, being better educated than most of the population, became teachers, gunmakers, government officials, and/or military officers. While the formal title of samurai was abolished, the elitist spirit that characterized the samurai class lived on. The oligarchs also embarked on a series of land reforms. In particular, they legitimized the tenancy system which had been going on during the Tokugawa period. Despite the Bakufu's best efforts to freeze the four classes of society in place, during their rule, villagers had begun to lease land out to other farmers, becoming rich in the process. This greatly disrupted the clearly defined class system which the Bakufu had envisaged, partly leading to their eventual downfall. The military of Japan, strengthened by nationwide conscription and emboldened by military success in both the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, began to view themselves as a growing world power. Centralization. Besides drastic changes to the social structure of Japan, in an attempt to create a strong centralized state defining its national identity, the government established a dominant national dialect called Standard Language, Hyojungo, that replaced local and regional dialects and was based on the patterns of Tokyo's samurai classes. This dialect eventually became the norm in the realms of education, media, government, and business. The Meiji Restoration and the resultant modernization of Japan also influenced Japanese self-identity with respect to its Asian neighbors, as Japan became the first Asian state to modernize based on the Western model, replacing the traditional Confucian hierarchical order that had persisted previously under a dominant China with one based on modernity. Adopting Enlightenment ideals of popular education, the Japanese government established a national system of public schools. These free schools taught students reading, writing, and mathematics. Students also attended courses in moral training, which reinforced their duty to the emperor and to the Japanese state. By the end of the Meiji period, attendance of public schools was widespread, increasing the availability of skilled workers and contributing to the industrial growth of Japan. The opening up of Japan not only consisted of the ports being opened for trade, but also began the process of merging members of the different societies together. Examples of this include Western teachers and advisors immigrating to Japan, and also Japanese nationals moving to Western countries for education purposes. All of these things in turn played a part in expanding the people of Japan's knowledge on Western customs, technology, and institutions. Many people believed it was essential for Japan to acquire Western spirit in order to become a great nation with strong trade routes and military strength. Industrial growth. The Meiji Restoration accelerated the industrialization process in Japan, which led to its rise as a military power by the year 1895, under the slogan of "Enrich the country, strengthen the military," Fukoku Kyohai. During the Meiji period, powers such as Europe and the United States helped transform Japan and made them realize a change needed to take place. Some leaders went out to foreign lands and used the knowledge and government writings to help shape and form a more influential government within their walls that allowed for things such as production. Despite the help Japan received from other powers, one of the key factors in Japan's industrializing success was its relative lack of resources, which made it unattractive to Western imperialism. The farmer and the samurai classification were the base, and soon the problem of why there was a limit of growth within the nation's industrial work. The government sent officials such as the samurai to monitor the work that was being done. Because of Japan's leaders taking control and adapting Western techniques, it has remained one of the world's largest industrial nations. The rapid industrialization and modernization of Japan both allowed and required a massive increase in production and infrastructure. Japan built industries such as shipyards, iron smelters, and spinning mills, which were then sold to well-connected entrepreneurs. Consequently, domestic companies became consumers of Western technology and applied it to produce items that would be sold cheaply in the international market. With this, industrial zones grew enormously, and there was a massive migration to industrializing centers from the countryside. Industrialization additionally went hand in hand with the development of a national railway system and modern communications. With industrialization came the demand for coal. There was a dramatic rise in production, from 0.6 million tons in 1875 to 21.3 million tons in 1913. Coal was needed for steamships and railroads. In 1873, there were 26 steamships, and by 1913, there were 1,514. Destruction of cultural heritage. The majority of Japanese castles were partially or completely dismantled in the late 19th century in the Meiji Restoration by the national government. Since the feudal system was abolished and the fiefs, Han, theoretically reverting back to the emperor, the national government saw no further use for the upkeep of these now obsolete castles. The military was modernized, and some parts of the castles were converted into modern military facilities with barracks and parade grounds, such as Hiroshima Castle. Others were handed over to the civilian authorities to build their new administrative structures. Some, however, were explicitly saved from destruction by interventions from various persons and parties, such as politicians, government and military officials, experts, historians, and locals who feared a loss of their cultural heritage. In the case of Hakone Castle, even though the government ordered its dismantling, it was saved by orders from the emperor himself. Nagoya Castle and Nijo Castle, due to their historical and cultural importance and sheer size and strategic locations, both became official imperial detached palaces before they were turned over to the local authorities in the 1930s. Others, such as Himeji Castle, survived by luck. During the Meiji Restoration's Shinbutsu Bunri, tens of thousands of Japanese Buddhist religious idols and temples were smashed and destroyed. Japan then closed and shut down tens of thousands of traditional old Shinto shrines in the shrine consolidation policy, and the Meiji government built the new modern 15 shrines of the Kenmu Restoration as a political move to link the Meiji Restoration to the Kenmu Restoration for their new state Shinto cult. Outlawing of traditional practices. In the blood tax riots, the Meiji government put down revolts by Japanese samurai, angry that the traditional untouchable status of burakumin was legally revoked. Under the Meiji Restoration, the practices of the samurai classes, deemed feudal and unsuitable for modern times following the end of Sakoku in 1853, resulted in a number of edicts intended to modernize the appearance of upper-class Japanese men. With the Danpatsurai Edict of 1871 issued by Emperor Meiji during the early Meiji era, men of the samurai classes were forced to cut their hair short, effectively abandoning the chanmage hairstyle. During the Meiji Restoration, the practice of cremation and Buddhism were condemned, and the Japanese government tried to ban cremation but were unsuccessful, then tried to limit it in urban areas. The Japanese government reversed its ban on cremation and pro-cremation. Japanese adopted Western European arguments on how cremation was good for limiting disease spread. So the Japanese government lifted their attempted ban in May 1875 and promoted cremation for diseased people in 1897. Use of foreign specialists. Even before the Meiji Restoration, the Tokugawa shogunate government hired German diplomat Philipp Franz von Siebold as diplomatic advisor, Dutch naval engineer Hendrik Hardes for Nagasaki Arsenal, and Willem Johan Cornelis, Ritter Hyson van Katendijke for Nagasaki Naval Training Center, French naval engineer François Léonce Verny for Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, and British civil engineer Richard Henry Brunton. Most of them were appointed through government approval with 2 or 3 years contract, and took their responsibility properly in Japan, except some cases. Then many other foreign specialists were hired. Despite the value they provided in the modernization of Japan, the Japanese government did not consider it prudent for them to settle in Japan permanently. After their contracts ended, most of them returned to their country except some, like Josiah Conder and W.K. Burton.